Welcome back. We are going to be starting a new series in 2018, and it is going to be looking at elementary statistics, which is important for those of you who are in the data field, who do any type of research or studying. And there's a lot of studies out there that I think are pretty fascinating and that we can investigate. We'll look at a few. I'm going to pick on myself in this video starting out because I think it's a good place to start in making fun of myself in the past for one of the studies that I did. On one of the articles I wrote about one of the studies that I did. But one of the good starting points, I think, anytime we talk about elementary statistics is to accurately define a population, accurately define the population that we're looking at. And as we'll see, this is easily overlooked. And just to give you a starting example, we're going to look at student loans. But let's start out with the simple terminology of student loan borrower or borrower of student loans versus young person versus college student. A young person may not go to college, so they may not be a student loan borrower. In the same way that a student also may not be a borrower. They may be going to college, but they may not be borrowing. They may be using scholarships. Their family may be paying for their student loans. They may be working and going to school. So student loan borrower also may not be a young person. It could be an older person as well who is using student loans and borrowing money to go to school. And that does happen as well. So when we say these terms, even though I have spotted many times in the media them using these terms as if they're the same, like a lot of the student loan, like the crisis with student loans and millennials, well, actually, what they're not telling you is that the data that they're getting are only looking at student loan borrowers. They're not looking at millennial borrowers. That's a totally different group of people, and they have to dig in to see that. And that is a mistake that a lot of people are making. So one of the first studies that I did, along with quite a few other studies of other generations, was this large study I did on the millennial generation. And so at the millennial generation, I looked at student loans. It was one of the things that I heard about. There was several pieces, retirement, etc., home ownership, and other things. And student loans was one of the big ones. And so I studied the millennial generation from about 2009 to 2012. And I was very precise in my definition of millennials. One of the things that I observed with anytime people say the word millennials, it's just so vague. Everyone has a different definition. So I just labeled it pretty clear. People born from 1980 to 1995, people born from 1996 on. I call them iGens, I-G-E-N-Z, because they only know of a world with the internet, whereas millennials they're closing in on the 2000s. And the other thing as well is when people looked at 20-year generations, I felt that the oldest and the youngest differ too much. I feel that 12 to 15 years is a better generational length just because they're more similar as a group. You start getting into 20 years and you get it to where you almost have totally different people. Well, among millennials with student loans, only 32% of the entire population of millennials had student loans. Now, for this example, we're going to round up, and I put 32 million, but what I actually should have put there was 40 million. So we're going to round it up to 40 million. I recognize that 32 million is correct, 40%. We're going to round it up to 40%, which is 32 million. That's correct. But I realize we are rounding up, so this is inaccurate in that we're going to bump it up to make it more of a crisis. So I want to put that alert. They're doing this intentionally to see, is there really this student loan crisis, even if we round it up really high. But if we think about it, not even 1 out of 3 millennials have student loans. It's close, but not 1 out of 3 millennials even has student loans. Only 32% of millennials have student loans. But since we are going to overcalculate here, we're going to say that 32 million, which would be 40% of millennials, have student loans. The actual data showed, of course, that 68% of millennials did not have student loans. So that means that at most in the real population, only 25.6 million, of millennials had student loans. So what was the median balance? Now remember, we've rounded up to that 32 million. The median balance of these 32 million millennials with student loans was $10,000. Okay, so even our over-calculated estimate would mean that at most 16 million millennials have 10,000 or more in student loans in this time frame. If we drill into the data even further, only 20% of all millennial student loan borrowers, only 20%, so we're using that rounded up figure of 32 million population here, had a student loan balance of 30,000 or more. So what that means, so 20% of 32 million is 6.4 million. So 6.4 million millennials total, out of the total population of millennials, had student loans of $30,000 or more. Okay, so let's think about that in terms of the whole overall population. 6.4 million out of 80 million millennials is just 8% of the population. This is the crisis, right, at the time of this study. So one of the things that I saw in the media, and this is when I was investigating, and the reason why I'm going to make fun of myself here. So I wrote an article saying that there was a student loan crisis. But when I looked at my data, I didn't see it. So what I did is I just assumed when I was doing my study, I was like, well, there's got to be a student loan crisis. I just haven't gotten enough data points yet. And even though my sample size was large enough, but I still assumed there was going to be some other data that I was going to find. And I never did find it. And I realized at the end of the study, I was like, I did not confirm there was a student loan crisis. And so as I started digging through the media about the student loan crisis, I started to spot the problem. The problem was that a lot of the people in the media were mixing up population terms. So you would go from, the balance, let's say the average balance of a student loan borrower, and they would apply that to all millennials. Well, all millennials may not go to college. You can't say that just because the average balance of people who borrowed money to go to school doesn't necessarily apply to all millennials, because the median balance of all millennials in terms of student loans is 0. Because a lot of millennials didn't go to college. And then of the millennials that went to college, a lot of them either paid for it themselves or had parents pay for it themselves or had scholarships. So only a small percentage of the millennial population, that would be 32%, actually borrowed money, borrowed student loans, I should say, used student loans to go to school. And that's out of the total population of millennials. So we know right off the bat then the median balance is 0. But what I saw with media is they would confuse when they would see a study that said the average student loan borrower, the median student loan borrower owes so much, they would assume that applies to all millennials. But no, all millennials didn't go to college, right? And so that's a big difference. It's an example of you're assuming one population is another, and that's not the case. Another thing as well is that people often would use average a lot. Remember that if someone goes to medical school, okay, or they go to law school, or they go to a higher level degree, they're generally going to make more money, especially medicine. Medicine is in a shortage. I've been saying this for the last 10 years. Nursing is now in a shortage for the last 3 years or 4 years. We have a huge nursing shortage here in the U.S., which is amazing because it doesn't take that long to get. But the wages of someone who is in nursing now too, but the wages of someone who goes into the medical career path they're going to make a lot of money, right? But they are probably going to borrow more, except for nursing. RN, you could technically get in about 2.5 years if you really hustle. So they're going to make more money, but they are going to borrow. For like an MD, you're going to borrow more, right? Same thing with law. You're probably going to borrow more, but the expectation is that you're going to make more. Well, if we have a population of just 10 millennials and 9 millennials don't borrow any money to go to school, right? And 1 millennial borrows $300,000 to get his MD. The average student loan balance of that 10 millennial population is $30,000, but 9 of them don't have student loans. So what is the median balance? 0, right? So in that example, average would not be accurate. Well, because the smallest student loan balance, it has to be an actual balance, remember, is, you could say, 1 penny. The largest balances are going to affect the average. So we wouldn't want to use average in this case. We would want to use median. Well, I'll get into that in other videos, but that's a great example of where you can make a crisis out for something on the basis of average and median and not understanding how those impact the data. So anytime you see the average student loan balance, this could end up being misleading. We want to look at the median. That's going to give us a more precise figure. The other one, which is always going to be popular every year, these articles, I should say, are super popular, is, let me go to the next slide here. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Now, I know that 75% of my channel is not American, so the majority of you do not live in the United States, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm going to pick on America just because this is very popular in the United States, and second of all, we can drill into the data in the U.S., and it makes it easier, but this applies to the world as well. Let's just state some realities that people overlook when they say the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Relative to the cost of living and other factors, having an increase in income may not be an increase in standard of living, which is more important than income. Your income can go up, but if your standard of living drops, who cares? People who are rich and poor move in and out of income categories. Many retirees have low incomes, like students studying medicine. when they're students, they're not going to have huge incomes, right? They're studying. In the case of students, where will they be in 10 years, though? Especially if they're MDs. If they're getting their MD, I should say. In 10 years, they're going to be doing really well since there's a shortage of MDs here in the U.S. Okay, so these categories are not stagnant, right? The retiree at one point may have been making $200,000 a year, but then he or she retires, and now they're only making $40,000 in, let's say, Social Security and dividend income, etc., right? Also, if a rich person gets a raise of 20% on his income, with his cost of living rising 25%, while a poor person sees her income stay the same, but her cost of living drops 40%, the poor person in this example walked away doing better in that year than the rich person. But the rich person on an income level got richer, while the poor person did not get richer. Right? So in that statement that we could have made, we could have said, well, the rich got richer, but the poor didn't get richer. The poor just stayed. It doesn't matter, though, because her cost of living dropped 40%, and the rich person's cost of living rose above his income. He actually walked away losing. Most, if not all, studies that look at the rich and the poor, the wealthy and the wealthy and those in poverty, are not looking at other factors outside of income. They're looking simply at income and wealth and assuming that that describes everything. So let's look at kind of a heat map, but not really a heat map, but let's look at a map of the number of high-income households. Now, household, by the way, is another word. Again, speaking of definitions, defining our population. Household and individual, not the same. The median individual income in the United States is around $29,000 to $31,000 a year. The median household income is $54,000 a year. Okay, that's because households can have multiple people. Remember that. They can be individuals, but they can also be multiple people. So this is the high-income households in the United States. This is where the distribution of where they live. We can drill into a few places, and we won't. We'll just look at this map overall. But if I just pick a couple of random areas that I know are very high cost living, for instance, Los Angeles, you think $250,000 sounds like a lot for an individual, and it does sound like a lot. But $250,000 in Los Angeles isn't a lot of money. $250,000 in Omaha, Nebraska is a lot of money, or Abilene, Texas, $250,000 is a lot of money, but in Los Angeles it's not. And what we find when we look at maps like this, and it's the same thing worldwide, is that people who are making a lot more income, right? Let's say they have high incomes. When you factor for their cost of living and where they live, a lot of times it's their cost of living and where they live that explains why their income is high. They're living in a high cost of living area. So they may not be enjoying what we would think of as the benefits of having that high income. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Maybe they figured out a way to save in that area. But a lot of times it is that they are living in very high cost of living areas. And so when I look at, like, for instance, Arizona, California, I can see a couple of places in Nevada, Utah, and I know one of the most expensive counties to live in. This always shocks people, but it's true. One of the most expensive counties to live in the United States is Wyoming. It's in Wyoming, I should say. And then when I look at even Texas, where I've lived in Texas, I happen to know that where you see a lot of those dark purple blots, those are also very expensive areas to live. There's only one purple blot that I see that is a high income. That would be the Midland, Odessa area. That is a cheap area, and there just happens to be a lot of multimillionaires there because of oil. That's one of those that's kind of an exception. But for the most part, a lot of these purple blots are explained by where they are. So if you're going to look at wealth, if you're going to look at income, and you're going to sit there and you're going to try to make the claim that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, a big factor that you're going to have to take into consideration is, but let's look at the region and cost of living and standard of living, and those are often overlooked. So, getting back to the basics here, define the population. When studying a population, at minimum, 3 things that I suggest. Number 1, define the population in as specific terms as possible. Numerical definitions are very precise. That's why I use birth dates for demographics. People can disagree. I try to figure out, what's the most accurate measure, and that's fine, but keep it numerical. I like Chris Reagan's, his definition of millennial, easily offended, right? But that's not very precise. Sorry, it's a great definition, but it's not very precise. Number 2, be careful about switching terms. In many cases, this causes errors in reporting data. It's true you may switch terms and they're the same terms, right? You may call them, let's say, Generation Y, same thing as millennial, right? But switching from, in this case, borrower is not the same as student, right? A person who borrows, let's say a student loan borrower in this case, is not the same as saying as a student, because a student may not be borrowing money, right? A student loan borrower is not the same as a millennial student loan borrower, because a student loan borrower may be Gen X, maybe a baby boomer, or maybe iGens now, right? So we have to be careful about using terms. We have to make sure that we're matching the term with what was on the study. And I caught a lot of this when I looked around, and it made sense. That's why I was like, oh, so everyone's saying this is a crisis, but actually it's not. And then, of course, and I'll have another video on this, but ceteris paribus seldom applies. Ceteris paribus is just Latin for the remaining being equal. But the idea here is that when we look at something such as incomes or wealth, and we're comparing, the rich to the poor as a case in point, well, we want to look at other factors, because it may not be the rich versus the poor. It may be, this town here is very low cost of living. This town over here is very high cost of living. And maybe it's not about rich and poor. Maybe it's about the area that explains everything. Geography really explains, by the way, a lot when it comes to income. And the example here I use is a person making $250,000 a year in Los Angeles cannot be compared to a person making $85,000 in Abilene. I mean, Los Angeles, California is much more expensive than Abilene, Texas. Okay, these cities differ significantly in cost. So while the former seems richer, when cost of living is factored in, the latter may be walking away with more money. There's too many other variables to look at there. Plus, everyone in California says the weather is so wonderful and so great. So clearly they're willing to live in a very high cost of living due to the weather. They're willing to pay for that high cost of living because of the weather. See, there's another factor there. Even if they're not doing so well, when you compare, let's say, the median home price to the median median household income, and then you compare the median home price, let's say, of Abilene to the median income of Abilene. But then somebody in California, and I've had many of them say this, oh, but you don't understand, Tim, like the weather is just, it's so amazing. So that's how do you quantify that, right? They're willing to live in an area that's much more expensive relative to their income because they feel that the weather is worth it. It's a little hard to quantify. So this just is a video to remind you of the importance of defining a population. Like I said, we're going to be covering some basics of statistics, some elementary statistics here over the next, I would say, about 60 days. And this is a good starting point because I think when you have your population defined very specifically, it makes studying your population very easy. And it also makes it very easy to spot errors, not just in your own studies, like I spotted errors in my studies before, but when people use terms that you're trying to compare and see, is your data just so out of whack or is it kind of similar, you may be able to spot discrepancies in others' data as well.